What's up, everyone? Pastor Ben here, and today I am bringing you another review. And this time, because I'm reviewing material that deals with young adult ministry, what better thing to look at than a book, specifically by that name, which is Sustainable Young Adult Ministry? So, right off the bat, should you read it? I would say yes if you are a young adult leader or if you're a leader in a church in any capacity, whether that's as a volunteer ministry leader or a staff pastor or a board member or whatever, because chances are your church is going to be talking about young adult ministry at some point if you haven't already, and this book would be a great resource for you. However, I would say that if you're someone who read Meet Generation Z, which is the book that I reviewed previously, and you're looking for more of a practical how-to guide, this book is not going to interest you very much. And we'll get into the reasons why in a little bit. So that's my general opening review. Should you read it? Yes, I would recommend it. But you might not get a lot out of it if you've read some other works dealing with young adults in general. All right, so on to some of the background of the book. It was written by two authors, although really it was mostly written by one author, Scott. He has a background in young adult ministry, and he points out on page 7 in the introduction that he really was the one who wrote most of it. And Mark, who is the other author, was really more of an editor and gave some input along the way. And Mark has a background in children's and youth ministry, and he's also the leader of an organization called, I want to make sure I get this right, Ministry Architects. So Mark is the founder. Scott works there too, and they both have a background in working with young adults. And this is where the background of the book is kind of interesting because this is actually a really good example of failing up. And I'm not saying that to be disrespectful. It's really true, and I think it works out to their benefit in writing this book because this book is in large part a collection of failures that they've experienced working with young adults. And so that is actually very clearly a motivation for them writing this book, is they wanted to write a book that drew from their personal failings and essentially serves as a warning to people who want to get into young adult ministry or who want to begin a young adult ministry or their church is considering it. And they talk a lot about, hey, if you're going to do that, don't do these things. And I think that's actually a really a good thing for them to do. But again, it also seems like a pretty good example of failing upwards. So that brings us to the purpose of the book. And the purpose of the book seems very clear. It's very much in large part how to not do young adult ministry. So they talk about common mistakes that you should avoid, things that a lot of churches put into practice that I'll give some examples in a minute. But they say, don't do those things. You need to think in a different direction if you're going to work with young adults. So that's a large part of the book. The other part of the book talks about certain paradoxes that you should consider and you should have in mind when you're developing a young adult ministry program or when you're just working with young adults in general. And as a quick note, the reason that I read this book, I've seen a lot of people recommend it. I have seen other podcasts do reviews of this book. But I did not hear about this book myself until I just saw it on Amazon. I had already started working with the young adult ministry. I'd already started one. So I was more looking for resources to seeing what ideas were out there because I was not aware of many. And this just came up on Amazon. I just typed in, young adult ministry book or something. And this was one of the first ones that came up. It seemed pretty good. So I picked it up and that's how I got it. The title seemed interesting. And the cover made me curious, so that's pretty much why. No one recommended it to me. I'm not sponsored, though I wish I was, if anyone out there is looking for that. But anyway, so that's why I got it. That's my background before the book. So now moving on to the content itself, kind of what I mentioned earlier, the first half of the book talks about what not to do. The authors share their mistakes. They shared how their churches started young adult ministries and how some of those early mistakes ended up building and led to the eventual failure of those ministries. And so they're reflecting on that. And they do share how the things that they implemented are, or I should say were, very popular ideas of people who want to start young adult ministries. And so the first half of the book really serves as a warning in that regard. Like, these seem like good ideas, but don't do them because it's only going to lead in failure. The second half of the book is really kind of a success through paradox. So they share various paradoxes of working with young adults. And I should clarify here, though, that when they use the term paradox, they really mean a paradox when viewed from a more traditional understanding of how ministries should function and where success comes from in ministry. So from that perspective, these are paradoxes, though if you are a young adult or you work with young adults, they're really not going to sound like paradoxes. You're going to read them, and like me, you're going to read them and think, I mean, these just make sense. This isn't really a paradox to me. So just, have that in mind. And interestingly enough, the book concludes in kind of a weird way. It sort of asks the question, okay, so how do you put these ideas into practice? And the way the book answers it is essentially saying, I don't know, just go out and do stuff. So it's not very practical in that regard. It essentially just, says, all right, well, here's our ideas. Best of luck to you. And that's how the book ends. So dealing more with the meat of the book, so the first half, some of the examples that they give, which are really bad ways to start a young adult ministry, and I'm not going to say, and the authors actually clarify this, it's not to say these are bad practices in and of themselves, but if you're wanting to draw young adults, if you're wanting to start a young adult ministry, don't do these as a launching point. Although some of the ideas they give are really bad, that you should just never do ever, such as, kick your old people out of the church, which some churches have done that in an attempt to draw young people in. And that's just a horrible idea. Don't do that. It's not going to work, and you're stupid if you do. That's my 2 cents. But some of the examples that they give, which, don't start a young adult ministry this way, are, changing the music style in your services. Don't do that if you're trying to draw in young adults. Don't build a coffee bar, sort of going against the idea, well, if you build it, they will come. That actually doesn't work. You might get young adults, but you're not going to attract people who are actually going to become, committed, really fervent Christians, which a lot of churches have already testified to that. And they say, yeah, don't do that as a way to draw in young adults. Another one is don't throw a pizza party and expect a young adult ministry to flourish from that. And also don't put your youth pastor in charge. And this is where it sort of gets into Meet Generation Z data territory, which is that people who are youth from like age 12 to 18, the people that your youth pastor are working with are dealing with fundamentally different questions. They are at a very different life stage than young adults. So don't expect your youth pastor to just take on essentially another full-time position and expect that to work. I mean, that's what these guys are saying. And I would agree, even from just a speciality standpoint, like you wouldn't take your children's pastor and put them in charge of the youth program. So in the same way, don't expect to take a youth pastor, put him in charge of the young adult program, and expect that to work. So I would definitely agree with the authors on this because I've seen that sort of in play at different points in my life and in different churches I've been in. It doesn't work. Though I would say, just as a general rule, that doesn't work. Even if you have a young adult ministry started, trying to have your youth pastor divide their time between working with youth and young adults is just going to be a huge strain on them, and you're not going to see a lot of success with it. So that's essentially the first half of the book. There's a lot more that they talk about, and I honestly, this was my favorite part of the book. I used a lot of the material from here in some of my presentations when I've been at churches and I've talked about young adult ministry. I gained a lot from this first part of the book. Even though a lot of it was stuff that I kind of already knew, they articulated it very, very well, I felt. So if you're going to read this book for nothing more, read it for the first half because that's really great stuff. The second half of the book really changes tones. Because the first half were based on a lot of personal experiences and very tangible ideas and concepts. The second half I feel is more useful if you're approaching it from the perspective of here's how to develop a philosophy of ministry for working with young adults. There's not a lot of practical examples. The few that are in there seem very broad and general, and just well, I would say for myself, I didn't find much use in it, to be perfectly honest. The second half, some of the ideas were good, but because I'd read Meet Generation Z, and I'd read it about a year before I read this book, and even then, a lot of the stuff they talked about in the second half was stuff I already knew from my own experience, but also from reading that book. So I didn't find a lot of use in it myself. At some points, it almost felt like they were just trying to hit a word count. I mean, I'm sure they probably weren't, but uh, just to say they don't really have a lot of new things to say or to offer in the second half. That's not to say it's bad, but it is a low point and a weakness of the book, I feel. So was the book any good? I did feel the book was good. Some of the good things are I do appreciate when books ask the question of why, which is a theme throughout this whole book. You know, why do you want to start a young adult ministry? What are the goals you're trying to reach? You know, what's your motivation, whether it's you as an individual or your church? Because that's really going to define your trajectory, and you need to consider those very seriously. Don't just assume that it's enough to say, well, we want to reach young adults. Like, that's not enough. You need to dig deeper. You need to be asking, better questions. Otherwise, you are going to fall into those very simple traps of, well, let's just change the music. Let's build a coffee bar. Let's just, give some more responsibilities to the youth pastor and then expect all that to work. Those are things that come from not considering the question of why enough. So I do appreciate that the book really encourages the reader to do that. Also, it was a very quick read. I read it, I think, in just a couple days. I read for a long time in those couple days, but it didn't take me long to get through because it does move very well from one point to another. The chapters are not very long, so you'll find yourself moving pretty quickly. But even then, it does give you a lot to think about on the way. So if this is your first exposure to young adult ministry and the resources that are out there, it is dense enough that you could spend a lot of time with it. I mean, like, again, I've seen podcasts do that. Like, they've talked, one episode is just one chapter, and they've done chapter after chapter. There is a lot of content here, but if you're already somewhat familiar with the material, you'll be able to move through it pretty quickly, which I thought was pretty nice. That being said, there were some bad things with it, things that I've already talked about. Again, while the first half is solid, the second half is more about ideas. It's not very concrete. I mean, one of the examples I give here is the one of the final chapters. I think it's the second to last chapter, is actually titled "I Don't Know Yet," which is kind of an admission of, okay, so how do you start a young adult ministry? And their answer is, well, I don't really know. So and they really conclude and they encourage the reader, just try things, which on the one hand was kind of encouraging. On the other hand, though, at least from my perspective, was also frustrating, because one of the reasons I picked it up was I wanted to see what ideas and practices were out there that people have had success with. And this book did not satisfy that. So I actually felt a bit deceived because the book, being titled Sustainable Young Adult Ministry, you would think, because this is what I thought it would have much more tangible ideas and concepts and practices that you can implement into your young adult ministry. And it really didn't offer much. It does offer something at the end of the book, which is essentially a step-by-step of how to start a young adult ministry. But even then, honestly, I'm not really sure why they put it in there, because some of the things they cover are either common sense, like, oh, build a database of your young adults that you know and contact information and what's the best way to contact them. That just sounds like a good practice in general. Like, that's not really something specific to young adult ministry. So in that regard, it really seemed like they were sort of grasping at straws, trying to say something that sounds like it's unique and something that's practical that they can offer. But also, when you look at that list, and I'm not going to read all of it because it covers several pages, but it's essentially a step-by-step guide for someone who is in a very specific situation. It's someone who, on the one hand, can essentially be a full-time young adult leader and has the time and resources to do that right now, but on the other hand, has not started anything yet. I mean, it's really, if you want to start a young adult ministry, like it starts at the very foundational beginning and walks you through every single step of a possible way of doing young adult ministry. Although they even admit, that this is just their idea. If they were to do young adult ministry again, this is probably how they would do it. Which is where the guide comes from, which was pretty useless for me because by the time I read this book, like I said earlier, I'd already begun a young adult ministry. I'd already made a lot of those decisions and had set things up and had already begun working within a certain model that I developed. So that part was pretty useless. So it's sort of weird. The one really practical thing that they offer, I had no use for, which was sad. I mean, I do appreciate that they tried, but I just don't know very many people that are going to find that particular part useful. So all that to say, I feel like a lot of people who are going to read this book are going to leave kind of asking the question of, okay, well, this is good material, but what do I actually do with it? And the book doesn't have an answer for that. Which, again, I find strange because when you're reading the first half of the book, it really seems like the first half is setting up this idea of, okay, we're telling you what not to do, but then we're going to tell you what you should do in young adult ministry. And they don't do that. They build this anticipation for something that never pays off, and they go a totally different route for the second half of the book. Now, obviously, it seems like that was their intention, but from a reader's perspective, it really seemed pretty deceptive. All right, so I'm going to give this book a final score. And so these guys I'm trying to do something unique with my final scores rather than just a regular point system. So these guys, again, work as consultants. Well, Mark is the president and founder. Scott's just a senior consultant. But they work at an organization called Ministry Architects. So off of the spirit of architecture, I would rate this book a 3/4 bath out of a master suite. There is a lot of really good content here. I do recommend reading it. However, if you're like me and you are already working in young adult ministry, this book will probably leave you feeling a little unsatisfied. So that's going to wrap it up for my review of Sustainable Young Adult Ministry. And let me know what you think. Do you agree with my conclusions here? Would you disagree? How would you rate it differently if you could? And also, what sort of resources would you like me to review? Again, whether it's books, podcasts, music, movies, whatever it is that deals with young adult ministry, not just so you could hear my thoughts on it, but also I'm interested in knowing what else is out there. So maybe there's things that I'm not familiar with that you are. What have you seen out there that touches on young adult ministry as a resource? Because I would like to learn more myself. So reach out to me and let me know what you think. Also, be sure to like, be sure to share, and be sure to subscribe for even more resources in the future. Also, check out our podcast. Jordan, who is my co-host for our longer segments, check out that stuff too. We're currently going through studying scripture. We'll see what comes after that. But yeah, thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time.